Yes, thank you, Robert. We'll just do a walkthrough of what was our thinking and very quickly get to the architecture. So how do I run the slides here? Sorry, it's... Oh, yes. Okay, found it. Yes. Okay, so here you see a typical cross-border case. In our conceptualization, there are always two sides. One is the data consumer. It is a party, an application, an e-government service, any application that wants to receive some data, and that is a data consumer. And then on the other hand, we have a data provider. So at the bottom of this diagram, where there is the information stored, typically base registers, but there can be also other types of data providers, and where we need to get that information from. In the different countries, we see that there are already some connectivity and some once-only operations, I would say, or once-only infrastructure. Some countries have what we call here a once-only layer, a national once-only layer. This is typically a way that a country and some countries are building that in connecting their e-government applications with their base registers, just to put it that simple. And they do it in whatever way they choose. Nationally, it's national infrastructure, but it's something that is an abstraction layer that we can see as a once-only gateway into a country. In some other situations, we have data aggregators, and this can be either meta registers that have an abstraction layer above several base registers, or they can be even manual or semi-manual or semi-automatic aggregations of data to provide a one-stop shop. So as you understand, in a typical cross-border scenario, because in TOOP we are trying to work with a scenario of mobility, so initially business mobility, but the architecture will work for citizen mobility as well, because there are these procedures foreseen by the Single Digital Gateway Regulation, but there are also other domains where we have such scenarios. And then we have a company or a citizen from country A having some type of interaction with the e-government application in country B, so country of destination, and then we need to do the cross-border exchange of data. As you understand, because there are different models in each of the countries, if we are to just connect bilaterally the countries, then it would be really impossible, and it would be a huge spaghetti, and it wouldn't scale, and it would not be enforceable. So we came up with the task of creating this federated architecture, the TOOP federation in the middle, where we can connect into the countries on the layers, or connect data aggregators, or connect directly the data providers and data consumers. So that is the two-country simplified model. This is a more complex, I would say, depiction of the piloting landscape, but also a more realistic one, because what this introduces, it introduces the federations and the networks of exchanging data that exist already. So you see on the right-hand side BRIS, which is very important for us because it already interconnects the business registers, the official business registers in the various countries, and the business registers are a primary source of data for TOOP, for business mobility in particular. So they are among the most important data providers. Then on the left side, we have other domain federations. Like in e-procurement, there is PEPL, and then there is in the maritime domain, there is one, there's in tax, and so on. But what this picture also shows is that unless an authority or a register are connected to one of the existing domain-oriented networks, there is no way for a general case of data exchange where any services data consumer could access data or could pull data, as we call it, from any of the registers in the bottom layer, the bottom layer of the data providers. This is why the TOOP federation is there, but we also see there's a federation of federations, because we foresaw from the beginning, and it now starts to become a reality, that the TOOP TOOP federation might link to an existing network. And we have just had some quite advanced discussions with BRIS on finding a way to initiate a request from any e-government service outside BRIS, go through TOOP, go with the business registers there. So we are actually starting to see that there is a policy push to have the federation, but also the federation of federations. So we just a couple of things about what are the use cases that we have and what we're piloting now in the project. So we have some cross-border services for business mobility, as we call them, and these are for e-procurement, the automatic retrieval of qualification evidences, but also of business data, because for those of you who are familiar with the European Single Procurement Document, which is a mandatory process and becoming electronic now, in 2018, that was the deadline. So that is one only use case that we hope we will implement through TOOP. Then we have licenses and permissions, typical examples of business mobility under the Services Directive, and the mandates and powers of representations. These are quite important for any business mobility scenario, and we're linking with other work that is being done, for example, by ISA Square in this domain. In the second pilot area, as we call it, we have the business registers, and then we see similar business cases from the point of view of the business registers, how the business registers provide data to external e-government applications, and how they provide data to each other. And there is a new company law package that has some once-only, I would say, aspirations or intentions, and those could very well come into play, particularly now that we are close to finding a way for TOOP to work with BRIS, that is the existing network connecting the business registers. And last but not least, is we have the maritime pilot, where we use cases to provide online access to ship and crew certificates, which is now actually a manual process to a large extent. And if it is digitized and it's done with in a way that's once on by design, that will be very beneficial. We just had yesterday a meeting with a similar domain, which is again ship and crew certificates, but for inland waterways inside the European Union. So similar type of use case, but in a different domain, so inland versus the open sea. So that's our current scope. But as Robert said, the architecture that we are building and the infrastructure and the tools and the components, they will have to work for the single digital gateway regulation, so they will work also for the citizen use cases. So in the second half of our project now, we will be looking at more use cases mainly from the SDGR procedures, in order to see whether we have some procedure-specific requirements that will cause us to fine-tune the architecture so that it fits them as well. We have two baseline scenarios, so two basic scenario flows. The first one is the simple pool of data. Again, as you see here, there's always a data consumer that requests the data and a data provider that provides the data, and there's the TOOP in the middle. So let's just see that as everything that we are building at the moment. In a generalized use case, which might not include or need to include all the steps in every particular case, but for a generalized scenario that is comprehensive, the process starts by identifying the user. That could be a citizen or representative of an economic operator that accesses the data consumer in another country, the country of destination, which is different than the country of origin where the data provider lies, and there is takes part in an online procedure. As part of that procedure, the data consumer realizes that certain information, certain data elements are needed. Then the first step is to, of course, get the consent of the economic operator, but then to ask, let's say, the TOOP infrastructure whether this data exists in electronic form and can be retrievable. This is the data discovery step. for that data to be discoverable, then the data provider must have already, at the prior point in time, published in the TOOP infrastructure the capability that the data provider can provide a particular set of data. So whenever a data provider is ready to provide the data, publishes that capability into the TOOP infrastructure, and then that capability can be discoverable. So then if there is a yes, the capability exists, so the data can be retrieved, then the data consumer will proceed. It will build a TOOP request for the data. It will send it over TOOP, which is mainly over eDelivery, which is the main reason we're here, to talk about the way we use eDelivery. It will send it to the data provider. It will be processed, and the response will be formulated, which will again go back through eDelivery. So it is a messaging infrastructure of request and response. It is asynchronous. Because of the GDPR requirements, as enshrined also in the Single Digital Gateway regulation, there are in some cases there's a need to have a consent, so an explicit request at the beginning of this process, so before the request is made. But also then after the response returns, there is a need to preview data that has been fetched and have the possibility to accept or reject the transaction. And this is because GDPR says that consent is necessary, but consent should also be possible to withdraw. That's why it's really the legal requirements that have made us to build this. And of course, consent can be also given at the data provider, but that would be more disruptive for the transaction. So our choice is what we're opting at right now, and we think we hope that this will be legally sufficient, is to do the preview and acceptance just before the data is actually consumed and reaches the data consumer. So the second scenario that we have very briefly, we call it notify and push. So let's assume that an exchange such as the previous one has already taken place. That's fine, but usually when there is a footprint of a person or a company from another country in data consumer, then there will continue to be a need for interaction. So why not give to the data consumer the opportunity to subscribe to a notification service whereby if the data changes at the data provider side, then there could be a notification that this data has changed, and this notification can be broadcast to all the data consumers that have subscribed to this service. And if the data consumer accepts to or wants to receive, or is still interested to receive the updated data, then there can be a classic request and response scenario like the previous one. So that's a second scenario that we hope to build now in the second part of the project. We are using the building blocks because we need to provide a solution that we are that will be usable in the relatively short term by the member states, and this means that we are using eIDAS, so ID building blocks and the eIDAS infrastructure for identification and possibly also for attribute exchange, such as mandates for those countries that will provide the possibility to fetch that infrastructure through the eIDAS infrastructure, and then we use eDelivery, which we foresee that this will be the main way of retrieving data and exchanging information between the data consumers and data providers. We will do semantic mapping, and we use some of the existing services, like I said. Basically, we need to use the CEF building blocks because the solution needs to be robust, supported by the member states and the Commission, and that implementation is feasible. Otherwise, if we were to go with something else, something more experimental, then it would be very hard that the member states implement with a timeline of a few years. And that's just a preview of the technical architecture before passing on to Jerry. Here you see the two systems that exchange data, so the data consumer and data provider. These are in red or burgundy there. They are the systems of the member states. The light blue parts are what we are building as a common components. So these are the parts of the connector that we build that links to an ACE4 gateway, and Jerry will explain how this interface works and what is the interface between the gateways. What we are saying to the member states is that they can use these common components and the connector and bundled with the gateway that works together. And we have published the implementation guideline for the interface between the connector and the member state systems, the data consumer and the data provider. Jerry will explain more. There are some central components because this connector, it has several modules. One is the module that does semantic mapping. So unless, generally speaking, I would say not every country in every domain that we are addressing here with once only will speak the same language, will have the same semantics. So what we need is a top semantic model, a common semantic model that can be used as the basis, either to be adopted by the member state systems, in which way we don't need to have semantic mapping, or it is a pivot format that we can map to from data consumer semantics to the top semantics, and then from the top semantics to data provider. And there we give the flexibility to the member states to either adopt the common model or do the mapping that is needed. There is a semantic mapping service that at the moment it's just a central component. There is the SMP and the BDXL components. Our initial suggestion is for the SMP is to, because that is not a centralized component that can be one in the country, but it can also be centralized for one domain if it's so desired. The architecture does not make any imposition on that. But there is also BDXL that is, as those of you who are even a bit familiar with eDelivery know that this is the central registry of DNS for eDelivery, and it is hosted by the Commission, by Digit. We also have a top directory, which is a way to do a lookup for the endpoint of the data provider, which is necessary in order to use the dynamic discovery and to build the top message. It is also a possibly convenient tool to indicate certain things, such as which are the authoritative sources of data and so on. In the top directory, we can, if it is acceptable by the member states, we would list the data consumers and the data providers that also have to trust each other. So that's another additional tool. So I would like to pass on to Jerry now to go more about the interface, but then just one last thing, just to tell you where we are. We just released on the 18th of May a first version, so it's not even version 1, it's 0.9, I would say, version of software specifications, so with a 0.8 version of the documentation. It's continuously being updated. Some countries are already started to implement, and by the end of September, we expect that we will have up to 5 countries that have implemented either a data consumer or a data provider capability. So it is starting to be a reality. We are going to study more use case variations and more procedures. We will. I hope that we will connect to BRIS in order to see how the confederated way of working through TOOP works, and we will, of course, support the implementation of the single gateway and provide input to the implementing. Yeah, these are the next steps. So, on to Jerry, unless there are already some questions that we should answer already.
I see a raised hand, so I don't know, Ines, if we do the questions now or wait for later.
Yes, I see that Jean-Marie has raised his hand. Jean-Marie, do you want to talk already, or? or do you wait until the end of the session?
Not yet, but can you please more loudly, because of it's very weak when you talk.
Sure. Yeah.
Or closer to the microphone. No, I have no. No, it's a good presentation. It's a good picture of the architecture. Not yet questions.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, then I will continue. So,